All right. All right. So we look like we're up to around 113 attendees, and so it is 11:30, and so we'll go ahead and get started with the webinar. And thank you all for joining. Thank you all for the ones that have joined multiple times and come to us on a monthly basis. And to everyone that's new, thank you for joining for the first time. We hope you find this beneficial and a good use of your time. I'm Justin Rowling. I'm the Vice President of National Sales for PharmaForce, and I have Anthony Velasquez, who is our Chief Product Officer. He will be doing the webinar. You won't have to listen to me the whole time, which everyone should be glad. So PharmaForce, what we do, so we're a full service TPA. We want to keep you compliant in your 340B program and also successful in that program. We do these webinars on a monthly basis. We want to share what's going on in the 340B environment. We know that everything has changed a lot in the last 3 years. And so we want to keep everyone up to date by using these webinars to get information to you. So the webinar is recorded. If you want to go out to thepharmaforce.com within a day or two, it'll be up. It's also on youtube.com. Just go to YouTube and put in PharmaForce to go to our page. And then we at the end, yes, so we have a Q&A, and we want everybody to participate. So if you have any questions, you can use the chat function. You can raise your hand in the end. We'll open it up and let Anthony answer your questions, and so you guys can get something out of this. But once again, thanks for joining, and look forward to hearing what Anthony has to say today about navigating 340B manufacturer restrictions and those tools for the success of that. Anthony?
All right, Justin, thank you so much for the introduction and being my partner in crime going forward on these webinars. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, which it's a big number of you, I'm going to do a quick introduction. I have been in the 340B space working for covered entities and on the technology side for over a decade. And one of the things that I hope to do with these webinars is to bring value, to bring knowledge and share experience and share what we're seeing in the industry and what we're hearing from covered entities, and ultimately help help those that are on this webinar, giving your valuable time to listen, to help you to get something useful out of this. So again, we're really grateful and thankful for your time. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a very timely topic today. I don't think you could go through a conversation with a 340B professional without discussing manufacturer restrictions these days. It seems to be there seems to be a weekly update, and it's almost like a major weekly update. If it's not a new court case ruling, it's another manufacturer jumping on board. It's a manufacturer updating a policy. So there's certainly a lot going on as it relates to this topic. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So for the agenda today, I want to talk about 5 things. So number one, I want to give everyone sort of like a current landscape of where are we today as it relates to manufacturer restrictions. I want to talk about the impact, and I want to touch on something that I'm not sure that a lot of folks involved in the 340B space are essentially bringing up in this conversation. Number 3, I want to talk about the process for submission. I just want to go through that process just to make sure if we have anyone new joining that is sort of new to the 340B world, or maybe you're on the fence, you're covered in these, considering submitting but hasn't done it yet. I want to go through that process. I want to share some common operational challenges that we're seeing covered entities struggle with and helping them through. And then I also want to talk about some tools for success. What are the things that you should be monitoring and be on top of to ensure that this process goes as smoothly as it can, being that it is very complex and very difficult to manage. So let's go ahead and get started. So current landscape, what is going on in sort of the 340B space as it relates to manufacturer restrictions? So as a lot of you know, drug manufacturers have imposed limits as to what 340B pricing that covered entities can access at their contract pharmacy specifically. So specifically, the limitations have been around covered entities that have multiple 340B contract pharmacies. And so we have seen a lot of limitations on that. Now it's up to 21 different drug manufacturers that have some sort of limitation or restriction. They're really all over the place. There's no sort of, one way that it's being done. There are some drug manufacturers that are limiting based on location or how many miles the contract pharmacy is from the covered entity. There are some drug manufacturers that are allowing you to continue to access 340B pricing at an in-house pharmacy without reporting the claims data, but others that require it for the contract pharmacy network. We've seen some that are now limiting the contract pharmacy network to one contract pharmacy, even if you are reporting to 340B ESP. The common theme seems to be that with these drug manufacturers, there is this option to submit claims level data to a third party company known by everyone as 340B ESP, where covered entities submit claims level data, and by doing that and agreeing to that, are then able to access 340B pricing at their contract pharmacies as per each individual policy. So again, I think it will be a lot easier to manage these restrictions if there was sort of like a one formula that everyone follow, one template, but that is not the case. To give you an example, just some recent developments, Johnson & Johnson has updated their policy, actually went into effect March the 7th of 2023, where in policy number 1, or the previous policy, which went into effect in May of 2022, there was an exception for in-house pharmacies, where in-house pharmacies could purchase Johnson & Johnson products without limitations, and also Johnson & Johnson products could access 340B pricing at multiple contract pharmacies as long as there was submission to 340B ESP. The new policy has changed that and has been, I think one of the most restrictive policies to date, where now it is limiting the contract pharmacy selection to one, and it's within 40 miles of the covered entity. I do want to be clear and clarify, this does apply to hospitals and not grantees. So I have a slide next where I'll show sort of the breakup between the two sides. But this policy has been, we've done some analysis, some financial analysis, and it is certainly impacting some of our hospitals in the tunes of millions of dollars as it relates to restricting Johnson & Johnson products from having 340B pricing. And also from a legal perspective, there was recently, not too long ago, there was a ruling in the Third Circuit case that essentially basically agreed that manufacturers can have some sort of restrictions on 340B pricing. That was a very unfortunate and a setback for covered entities in sort of this fight in accessing products to be able to serve patients with 340B purchased drugs. Now, there's two other cases that are pending decisions. There's also recently it's come out that HHS is considering submitting a full appeal on that Third Circuit case. So there's a lot going on in the legal realm as it relates to this that could ultimately turn positive. We just don't know. We just don't know. We could hear sort of any day now what some of those outcomes are. So there is some hope, I think, from a legal perspective still. I think there's still some hope that I'm not sure where if this would get to a federal policy point where maybe there is some sort of policy passed by Congress that relates to 340B. There's certainly a lot of noise being made in that world. So we'll see what happens with that. But that's sort of the latest as to where we are at the moment. And then I have the slide to show basically the picture that I'm trying to show here is that for those of you that are on the line that are hospitals, so you work for a DISH, a critical access, a Soul Community, some of these even apply to cancer hospitals. Those of you that are in the hospital world are impacted to a greater degree than the grantees. Now, unfortunately, the grantees are also impacted by this. But those of you that are in the hospital world are impacted to a higher degree. All 21 policies have some sort of restrictions on hospitals, and there are about 6 policies that have restrictions on grantees. Now, those are still major restrictions. This file is not completely up to date. I do want to share that in case someone notices something not completely up to date. For example, the Johnson & Johnson section at the bottom needs to be updated, but this is, and this also doesn't consider exceptions for in-house pharmacies and things like that. This is purely just from a contract pharmacy perspective, but I think this gives you a clear image that if you're in the hospital world, this is certainly something that's impacting you, and you have contract pharmacies. This is something that is highly urgent and something that should be at the top of everyone's list. Now, next, let's talk about the overall impact. And there's something that I want to share here that's really interesting that I think some entities are bringing up, and I have started some conversations, but not as much as I think it should be. Now, yes, there is a financial impact. I think that is clear. I spoke yesterday to a covered entity that is losing $300,000 in 340B revenue a month as it relates to manufacturer restrictions. Another one over $100,000 a month. I mean, these are real numbers that are essentially, not going back into the covered entities to serve patients and fulfill their mission and provide care to patients. And the one thing that I want to point out that I haven't heard a lot of is how these manufacturer restrictions are impacting patient care. And what do I mean by that? We have had a significant amount of covered entities have challenges with their cash card now. Now, if the covered entity is deciding not to submit to 340B ESP because of X concern, or if the covered entity is sort of forced to block access to 340 to specific NDCs at their contract pharmacies that were previously accessible via a cash card program, that has now been limited, and those covered entities are having to find ways to help those patients get access to those medications. So a patient that maybe would access their insulin medication at a very low cost is now having to scramble and find a different way to access that drug. And I know that entities are doing all they can to help with that, but it is a significant, I think, disruption of patient care that I have not heard brought up as much in this conversation because of, obviously the financial and impact of it, and the fact that covered entities believe, and we believe, that this is an illegal act and against a 340B ruling and policy. So the patient care is one impact that is that's certainly being impacted by this. There's a financial impact. I think it's very important, if you're a covered entity, to know your numbers, to know what your loss of revenue is or might be, to have that by manufacturer, so that if there is an updated manufacturer, a new manufacturer comes up, you're able to quickly identify what that impact will be to your 340B committee, your 340B team, your leadership. Keep a tracker. I would even recommend keeping something by store, and on a monthly basis, tracking your manufacturer volume by store under all your chains, because that can be very valuable information to help you quickly analyze what your highest risk area is. For example, if you were a covered entity that had a significant amount of savings related to Johnson & Johnson products, what does that financial impact look like now that there's been changes and updates to that policy that could impact you perhaps at your specialty pharmacies and things like that. So now, how do you get this information, right? It's easy to say, know your numbers, put these numbers together, but how do you get this information? I think your TPA can be helpful. If you are a covered entity that uses a third-party administrator, perhaps ask your third-party administrator if they have any type of impact reports that they can provide. If you're not using a third-party administrator and you're running your program with a separate inventory or one of those situations, then you will have to pull that data from your pharmacy system and pull those reports and put that data together. But long story short, you want to have a tracker. You want to be constantly tracking these numbers to know what the impact is to you, and maybe even track the impact to your patient care. All right, next, I want to talk about the process of submission. What does this process look like, right? This is as I mentioned, it is a very difficult, it's a cumbersome process. But essentially the process of submission is like this. So number one, you have to identify specifically how the restriction, so if you're a grantee, you have 6 to worry about. If you're a hospital and you fall under the category of a DISH hospital, critical access hospital, sole community hospitals, there's a few instances where those are not impacted. But if you are, then you want to consider which type of restrictions apply to your hospital. Now, number two, you also want to know that when you're doing your analysis, this goes back to my previous slide on determining financial impact, that not every single NDC manufactured or sold by that manufacturer is sometimes removed from 340B pricing access. There are times where the manufacturer is identifying a very specific number of NDCs, a very specific, sometimes it's a handful of NDCs, sometimes it's the entire labeler code, sometimes it's unique NDCs. So you want to make sure that you are tracking the specific impact to your covered entity. Now, please keep in mind, deadlines are very important. There are a lot of instances where covered entities are not meeting those deadlines. So a manufacturer restriction letter might say you have until February the 27th to submit your form or sign up with ESP, et cetera. And if that's not being kept up to date or that deadline is not followed, that could cause delays into how quickly you get access to the 340B pricing. It might get you into a position where you're losing claims that you can't replenish because there's a look back period on the data service of the claim. So to give you an example, if you had a deadline of February the 20th and you missed that deadline, you have to go through the process of trying to get the manufacturer to provide pricing. Every sort of week that goes by, you could be losing those prescriptions prior to February the 20th that you still want to replenish at 340B pricing. So that's why those deadlines are very important. As you're going through the process, keep in mind there are some times where you just need to fill out an exception form for an in-house pharmacy, et cetera. Sometimes that also it falls under a deadline that you have to meet, but you want to know, do we fall under the exception rule, or does our covered entity have contract pharmacies and have to select one pharmacy, or can we do multiple pharmacy? Or maybe you're not wanting to participate at all and you don't feel comfortable doing that, then you want to make that decision clear to you, your team, and your leadership. Now, then comes the sort of the harder part of compiling the claims data. So I hear this has been a challenge, especially if you have multiple TPAs. So there's covered entities that you're working with a TPA for your independents, you're working with a TPA for your Walgreens, a TPA for your CVS, et cetera. And maybe you even have an in-house pharmacy that you're doing manually. That compiling that claims data bi-weekly can be a challenge. So you want to, as you're putting this process in place, you want to consider that as part of your workflow. And now, this is the sort of the biggest takeaway, I will say, and one of the big key points that we want to highlight where we're seeing, challenges in the process, and that is price restoration. So you want to make sure that the price is restored. Once the price is restored, then you can sort of release orders or turn your ordering back on at your TPA. And then you want to monitor the pricing on an ongoing basis, as it relates to usage. Basically is what allows you to access the pricing. All right, so that's the process. Now let's talk about some of the operational challenges. So let's say that you are a covered entity on this webinar today, and you're wondering, okay, that process looks simple enough, but what are the challenges around it? And you know what? I don't think it's simple. I think it's a very complex and unfortunate thing that has to happen, that covered entities have to do, but it does come with some very real operational challenges. So here are a few that I compiled. So number one is the legal concerns. Maybe your covered entity, your legal team just doesn't feel comfortable submitting claims data to 340B ESP. I've heard a covered entity saying, we don't feel comfortable with the language in the BAA, and just not wanting to, move forward with that at all, and standing on principle and not submitting and refusing to do that. I heard of a covered entity that has a process where they're submitting directly to one manufacturer instead of going through 340B ESP. So some of that is going on. I'm not sure how relevant that is or how often that's happening, but there's legal concerns, and that seems to be the sort of the biggest one that comes up is, we're not comfortable doing this, we're not going to do this, or our team is not in favor of doing this. Number two is the claim submission effort and tracking is enormous. Putting this data together, especially if let's say you have 200 contract pharmacies or 100 contract pharmacies, and you have 3 or 4 different TPAs, you have to pull data from all these different places. You have to do that twice a week. You have to do that twice a month. Some TPAs have processes where they give you a formatted data. Some TPAs have processes they submit on your behalf. Right. There's a lot of different ways that this can be done, but the effort is still there, and it is very time consuming. The third challenge, and is the pricing restoration. This is what we saw even at the beginning of all of this being one of the biggest challenges, is that there were retail-like pricing on catalogs, and CEs unfortunately had replenishment occur at retail-like pricing on those catalogs, and some were able to recoup via credit and rebill, others were not. But unfortunately, that the pricing restoration is still a very big challenge in this. For example, the time that it's taking, some CEs are reporting, hey, I did everything I could, and now I'm just waiting and nothing's happening, and I'm not getting pricing, 340B pricing. CEs have posed questions of, is that the correct ceiling price, right? It's hard to know when you're looking at catalogs with hundreds of thousands or thousands of records, whether you're getting the correct ceiling price. And that's something that perhaps, you need some sort of process in place to help with that. And then managing the ordering is still a challenge of, if you lose pricing, you have to block your NDCs from being auto replenished to your contract pharmacies. Once the pricing comes back, you have to release the orders again. And, so it's a very in-depth and hands-on process, unfortunately, to track all of this, especially if you're dealing with, 21 different restrictions. And the red flag monitoring, as I mentioned in the previous slide, this is usage-based. You have to submit usage of claims in order to sort of build a backlog that then you can order against. So, be careful. Their 340B ESP does send emails, is my understanding, if a particular store is identified as ordering more than what was previously submitted. So you want to keep an eye on that. The red flag by 340B ESP can cause you to lose 340B pricing at that particular store or that particular 340B account. All right, now I presented all the problems, right? I told you all sorts of issues, all sorts of challenges. So what are some of the ways that you can be successful in this? So number one, monitoring is the key. Unfortunately, this is very hands-on, very time-consuming. There's no easy way around it. I think your number one tool for success is to figure out a way to monitor pricing on your catalogs and or invoices. And I say invoices because every TPA is different. Some TPAs do give you access to your what's called an 832 drug catalog that comes from the wholesaler. Some TPAs do not. So you might have to rely on invoices. Maybe you can build some custom reports to get from all your different TPAs on how to track this. But that is a very important sort of key to being successful, because you don't want to do all of this and then find out you're still ordering at the wrong pricing. You're not ordering the ceiling price. Number two is the claim. So making sure that there's timeliness and submission, that you're doing this bi-weekly to make sure that your usage keeps up with your ordering, making sure that you consider look back period. If you're trying to submit really old claims that you went back and captured, through a 6-month review or something like that, or maybe you're doing a reprocessing, you want to consider that sometimes that might not happen. You might not be able to capture some of those. Here's a really good tip. If you have pharmacies in implementation right now, you want to get that data submitted. You want to get ESP squared away and have that data submitted as soon as possible. Even if you're not ready to turn on ordering, you want to get data submitted so that you can build a usage backlog that then you can order against. So you want to go ahead and do that as soon as possible, because as I mentioned here in my third check mark, that the usage versus purchasing is something very important to be aware of. If you start ordering way more than what you have submitted in the past, you will be flagged and potentially lose 340B pricing. Ultimately, like 340B, in general, our favorite word is to audit. You want to audit that you are submitting claims on time. If someone else on your team is doing that, you want to audit your blocks. Like if, you don't want to have situations where you did all this hard work, you're submitting, but then for some reason your TPA blocked those NDCs from being ordered. You want to make sure that that's happening and that you're monitoring that those orders are going through successfully. So those are some of the things that we are seeing as it relates to this. It is still, I think it's going to take a while for covered entities to have a really good handle on this as it continues to change. I really do hope that the information I shared was helpful. The last thing that I'll share is, unfortunately, this manufacturer restriction situation is causing issues, even at a point where there's reports that that NAC, the National Association of Community Health Centers, is working with a pharma group to do some legislation or some proposed language that could reduce eligibility for hospitals in the 340B program. I think at the beginning there was certainly let's get together, let's stand together at this, and it looks like here at the end there's a little bit of a breaking of that. But overall, I think for patients, for covered entities that are struggling, that are wanting to keep the doors open, service their community, both grantees and hospitals, I'm personally hopeful for a positive outcome that allows 340B program to potentially go back to the days prior to these manufacturer exclusions and restrictions. But with that being said, I do want to share, we do have our next webinar. It's going to be on manufacturer restrictions, but we're going to discuss things that you can do and you want to make sure that you're doing, like referral capture service and having that program, like taking advantage of specialty pharmacies and things like that to overcome any lost savings that you might have. So those emails are going to be going out soon for you to sign up to join that webinar with Justin and I. And I see some people dropping off. We're going to have a really great Q&A question, so you don't want to drop off too soon because you might miss some really good questions. But Justin, I'll turn it back to you so we can get started on the Q&A.